Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm William Moore, the Spectator's features editor. And the magazine has just gone off stone. You can see the wonderful cover behind me. Fight Back, Kemi Badenoch tells Tim Shipman how she plans to save the Tories. And I'm delighted, of course, to be joined by Tim Shipman, who conducted the interview. Tim, thank you very much indeed for joining me. So what is the plan for a fight back now then? If the first year's been a bit of a disappointment, what are the next stages?
Well, I think it's summed up by the slogan for conference, which we revealed today, which is effectively stronger economy, stronger borders. The borders bit will involve leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. The detail of that, it sounds like, will be mapped out in a speech on Sunday. So in the same way that Theresa May turned up at conference in 2016, gave a speech on Brexit first and then did her big sort of national address on the Tuesday, I think we're going to get the same from Badenoch. She's still waiting for the report from Lord Wolfson on how they would go about doing that, and she wants to hold a shadow cabinet meeting, which I understand will be on Friday. So you can probably expect the details to start leaking at that point, and then she will announce it properly on Sunday. The second strand of it is, I think, where they think, you know, the Conservative Party still has some role in British public life, has an argument it can make both at the expense of Labour and at the expense of Reform, which is to go hard on sort of economic competence. This is obviously a tricky argument to make. We are still only 2.5 years since Liz Truss's mini budget, which, you know, you listen to any focus group, that still hangs over the Tories. But, you know, you have a Labour Party that is 30 billion in the red by the sound of it and is going to have to raise taxes to solve the problem. And you have a Reform Party that is talking about spending a great deal of money as well and borrowing it too. So I think that's her way in. She's talking in this interview fairly passionately about deindustrialisation and reversing that. And the thing that she's got in her sights in this interview is the Climate Change Act, which she says the Tories would scrap. Now, Badenoch's probably most successful public intervention so far was to sort of retreat from Conservative sort of full-throated support for net zero. And in this, she's basically saying the Act itself forces ministers to do stupid things which are counterproductive, which cost money and which don't actually help the environment a great deal, and we want to do away with that. So that is going to be a pretty clear dividing line between the Tories and Labour, and it's, you know, an eye-catching way of making the same point that she made before. So that's the substance, and she says, you know, climate change is an issue, but this stuff, you know, we've got a quango that tells us to eat insects rather than meat. It forces ministers to announce things like, you know, forcing everyone to have a heat pump, and the pace at which we're doing that will take 300 years. And effectively saying, you know, the Climate Change Act sounds very nice. On the face of it, it sounds like it's tackling climate change, but it isn't. It's just wrecking the economy, and it's not achieving a great deal. And being the goody two-shoes of the world, as she puts it, is not helping us or really persuading anybody else to come with us. So this is all a waste of time. So that's, you know, it's a decent announcement, and there will be more at conference. But as ever at conference, it's not just about the policies you announce, it's about the mood, it's about whether you look like you are competent on top of things, when you do come into contact with the media, whether you stay on message, and you know, that is case unproven. I mean, last time, I think, you know, Badenoch made probably 5 reasonably sized gaffes in the space of 2 days and then announced, I don't do gaffes, which was an interesting way of making a 6th gaffe. So let's see. But, you know, is she bullish? Is she cowed by this desperate situation she's in? Not really. Yeah. And people will either find that impressive or tone deaf, depending on where they stand.
Yes. But if the message is strong economy, strong borders, even if the arguments that she's making seem very reasonable and maybe would be popular with the public, are the Tories just in a position where, because it's them making these arguments, people aren't going to like it? I mean, a lot of the net zero agenda was pushed by various Tory governments, Theresa May's government, and Boris Johnson's government. And then when it comes to immigration, you know, everyone's talking now about the Boris wave and the largest migration figures that this country's ever seen, again under a Tory government. do people just not want to hear this stuff from Tories anymore?
Well, I think that's the danger. And she needs to understand that she's still, she's not exactly pushing against an open door with the public. I suspect Reform will turn around and say that what she's got planned on the ECHR doesn't go far enough and is too nuanced, and really it's going to be hard to outflank Reform on migration. Interestingly, Labour have just spent their conference, instead of trying to run towards it, really pushing back hard against it and saying some of what Farage is proposing on deporting people with indefinite right to remain, making that a big dividing line. I think in the economic sphere, she's got more chance of defining the Conservatives as separate and different from both of those other main parties in the polls. And I think that's where she's going to have to sort of put her shoulder hardest to the wheel. But in terms of the party faithful, I think they will want to see her looking a bit more on message and on the right page than she did a year ago. And it may be that this sort of apparent overweening confidence may not be the thing that is quite the ticket there. So, yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, one of the people who advises her says it takes 2 years before the public is prepared to even forgive, let alone forget what previous governments have done, and we're not yet at that point. And I think the problem for Kemi Badenoch is that, people who look back at what Margaret Thatcher did in opposition in the late 70s was, look at all the problems, diagnose the problems, then come up with some solutions. She very, clearly put in place a plan to spend 4 years doing this. I think the problem she's got is that the electoral arithmetic, the polls, and the sort of political calendar does not work in her favour in that sense. She's got to turn up in May next year and not have a total massacre, because if it's quite hard to see how an already much reduced Conservative Party with a bunch of MPs who are already looking over their shoulders, worrying about losing their seats to Reform, if some progress is not shown, I find it quite hard, knowing the sort of homo conservaticus as we do, that they will sit on their hands and do nothing about it. So, she can make an argument about long-term change as much as she wants. She needs to show some progress. And frankly, MPs could think about ousting her from November the 2nd onwards, which is the anniversary of when she took over. If conference goes well, I suspect that will buy her time between November and May. But unless she shows progress between November and May, I think some kind of leadership challenge is fairly likely thereafter.
Finally, just looking ahead from the local elections in May and to the general election, which people are already, of course, talking about, Keir Starmer is acting as if the Tories are a dead party. The next general election will be fought between Reform and Labour. Is he right?
I mean, that's what the polls suggest at the moment. And Starmer's speech to conference was interesting in that he didn't quite paint the Tories into the same sort of extremist bucket as he did Reform. And he actually made overtures to Conservative voters, kind of saying, ultimately, the choice is going to be between me and Farage. And if you oppose the sort of politics of extremism as I do, we want you to join us. If that starts to get any traction and Kemi Badenoch starts losing the sort of, stop Farage vote, as well as hemorrhaging the kind of hardcore anti-immigration vote to Reform, she's going to be in even more trouble than she is at the moment.
Well as your superb cover piece, Tim, we've got many wonderful things in this week's magazine. So to discuss further, I'm delighted to be joined by The Spectator's commissioning editor, Lara Brown, and regular Spectator contributor, the author and academic Philip Hensher. Thank you very much for joining us. We've just been talking about Kemi Badenoch ahead of the Tory party conference. And of course, one of the quirks of this year's Tory party conference is it almost coincides with the 100-year anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's birth, which is on October the 30th, as I'm sure you all know. And we have this piece in The Spectator this week by William Atkinson, who is a sort of long-term devotee of Thatcher. But he argues that the Tory party in order to survive, needs to kill the cult of Thatcher. And I think you get the sense from the piece that he's saying this with a heavy heart, but he thinks it's finally time for Tories to move on from her. And I'd love to know, Lara, what your thoughts were on his argument. Is he correct?
I really liked Will's piece. I think the idol of Thatcher hangs over every Tory conference and every Tory leadership election. And this is almost no longer about anything that we've seen from Thatcher the person. It's about this sort of broader identikit image. And when I watched the Kemi Generate Leadership Contest, the question in most members' minds seemed to be, which one is Thatcher? And when Liz Truss and Rishi thought it out, again, it was, which one is the most like Thatcher? And you lose all sense of her policy. You lose all sense of the responsiveness of her actions to the unique complexities of the 70s and 80s. And you basically often go for a seemingly sound right-wing woman who says a few hard truths here and there and, talks tough to journalists. And I think we're saying that again. It's interesting that Will ends on a reference to Katie Lamb. And Katie is clearly a very impressive MP who will go far, but she's already being described as, is this our Thatcher? And the solution to the Conservatives' problems, if there are one, isn't going to be an identikit Thatcher or someone that fits that mould. So, I think she's brilliant. I'm not as critical of her as Will, but I do think there's something in this about how much the Tories have been led astray by a waiting for Thatcher 2.0, which is not going to come.
Yeah, well, and there is that cult element to Tories and Thatcher, which I think is definitely true. William begins his piece by talking about having a poster of Thatcher, like every good Tory boy, a poster of Thatcher in his bedroom when he's 15.
This isn't a surprise. The bigger surprise is that she was peering down at his teddies.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that William still had teddies at 15 to me is much.
That's true. But regardless, I was wondering. Actually, I wanted to ask Philip, because since you're a great lover of Thatcher, did you ever have a poster?
I didn't. I don't really have. I wasn't really a poster kind of person. I think the problem that we have now is that it's the Thatcher principle, if you like, has been submerged in the Thatcher costume drama, really. And there are principles that Thatcher brought to politics then that are still extremely valid. Personal freedom, political freedom, don't spend money that isn't yours, keep government expenditure down. All those are perfectly good political principles. And when I see, politicians waving flags now, it seems like a performance. But when you see, the Mrs. Thatcher's flag waving in 1982 after the Falklands War, that was somebody who was sticking up for the Palmerston Don Pacifico presence that we stick up for British citizens wherever they are. So I think that actually those principles of Thatcher, they're still as valid now as they ever were. And I don't think there's anything to be gained from saying we move on from them. We might want to move on from the pussy bow collars and all the rest of it.
The sort of cartoon image of
not from that attitude towards expenditure and freedom.
Yeah. Were you ever in the Thatcher cult, Tim?
No, not growing up. But watching her downfall at the age of 15 was one of the things that made me want to be a political journalist. I mean, I think what William gets right in this piece is that he says the Tories must learn from Thatcher's methods rather than bow to an idealised version of her. And my experience dealing with Tory MPs over the last 20 years is that a lot of them have a very caricatured view of Thatcher. Yeah. They think it's a few sort of hard iron principles. And actually, of course, what she was successful at is being ruthlessly pragmatic as well. She beat the miners because she'd stockpiled the coal in advance. People seem to forget that the top rate of income tax, didn't go down to 40p in 1979. It took till about 1986 before Nigel Lawson had the balls to do that. So I think there's a lot of misnomers and a lot of people who weren't around at the time or have not read Charles Moore's books and seen the sort of gradations of, the subtlety that she had. Philip's right. There are some principles that remain, but it would help the the Conservative Party if they understood a bit more of the nuance. Actually, Ian Dale's just done quite a good book that kind of delves down into this and sort of says, the caricature is wrong. And I think, it would help most Conservative MPs if they read that rather than thinking about this sort of identikit Thatcher that has been sort of paraded over the years.
One of the other, sorry,
Interesting to see the things that she did do immediately, and there were some immediate steps, and one of them was that rule that when you went abroad on holiday, you could only take £125, and that went immediately, and that was an important statement of fact. But the whole process of privatisation, for instance, was a very long, drawn-out process.
Yeah.
So people are always amazed to be told that Mrs. Thatcher didn't privatise the railways. That was John Major.
And she didn't really get going until the second term on most of that stuff. The initial thing was dealing with the economic problems and shock treatment. And actually, you do sort of wonder, with the kind of much quicker sort of rhythm of news and public debate these days, whether she would be given the time. Things before the Falklands War, things were in a pretty dire state in the polls and, the state of the economy, and whether a leader now could weather that in quite the way that she was able to. The other thing I would point to is the ability of people to make a sort of simple argument. Mrs. Thatcher was not someone who you imagine would be completely at ease in a world of, X and sound bites and endless sort of clips for the TV. But what she was very good at was standing on the stage and sort of explaining, the government's finances in terms that people could understand around their kitchen table. And I think, Kemi Badenoch may have got the sort of stridency and the determination and all of that. I'm not sure she's quite yet been able to, boil things down to sort of simple to understand slogans in the way that Thatcher was able to. And, Philip mentioned the pussy bows. I mean, Liz Truss literally wore pussy toes. And you just sort of thought, oh, come on. This is, oh, I didn't even realise.
And
the accident. And it was also an accident that you went to Moscow and stuck a fur hat on.
And riding the tank.
Exactly.
Riding the tank.
I mean, it was sort of this attempt to kind of just repeat these memes. It was sort of rather pathetic.
Yes, people seem to fall for it. I mean, like a lot of, you know what I mean? A lot of Tories, a lot of Conservative voters.
Am I the only person on the table who can actually remember her coming to power?
Yeah, I was 4.
I was 15,
and I only met her late on, when she frankly was not in at the best state. So I had one sort of brief audience.
I bet you when I was 7. I offered her a wine gum. She refused it. Yeah. Politely, I should say.
But I think
if you'd offered her a scotch, she'd have accepted.
My memory of that time, not close up, but the mood in the country was that here we were being offered a compelling narrative of where the country was going to go for the next few years. It was going to be hard, it was going to be difficult. These steps needed to be taken, and there was something idealistic about it. And even if you didn't share the idealism, or if you thought, oh, well, no, that's nonsense, at least there was something very positive. It wasn't just somebody standing there and saying, oh, well, we've got to do something about the last 14 years of Labour misrule, which is what we're getting now. Yeah. I think the problem for Keir Starmer, by contrast, is nobody knows what that narrative is.
In terms of sharing people not sharing those ideals, Philip, it must have been quite lonely in some ways for you being in the literary world, being an author and being pro-Thatcher. I mean, surely there were not very many of you.
Being in the literary world, you need to be solitary. If you're just looking around you and agreeing with everybody around you, then you're not much of a literary person, are you?
Yeah.
Novelists are contrary people. They just are. A novelist that wants to seek approval is worth nothing. Really. Also, I'm 60 years old. I'm too tired.
Lara, one of the other things that William says in the piece is he says that there's so many figures from Tory party history who could act as I suppose lodestars that people could give a good example for Tories today. He mentions Enoch Powell as one figure who is animating a lot of young right-wing Tories. What do you think of that? Do you agree with that, or are there other figures that you think young Tories should be looking to?
So I think Will is right to identify Enoch Powell. If you look at the, as they call it, sort of the young online right, there's a very sudden and very rapid veneration of Enoch Powell and a lot of what he said. You see various speeches or essays that he wrote floating around, and quite a lot of what Enoch Powell was like calling for and talking about, and the battles that he lost in his day, represent things that have come to pass. There's an excellent speech where he warned basically that if the two parties, the left and the right, sort of became too close together, people would become very disaffected very quickly and very angry, and that's something that a long time later we have seen. I think William is going to be doing a defence of Enoch Powell at Tory party conference, which will be quite interesting. But I think the difficulty with Enoch Powell that Thatcher doesn't share is he failed in a lot of his sort of stated goals in his lifetime, and he wasn't able to win people over in the way that Thatcher was. I mean, I'd probably say we should look more to Pitt if I had to pick a Conservative figure. Maybe we've gone back a bit too far there.
Yeah. Did you have a Pitt poster on your wall growing up?
I'm more of a Disraeli and a Bismarck man myself.
Very good.
I have a bust of Bismarck.
Yeah. Very finally, Philip, listeners may know this, or they may not, but you wrote a book on Thatcher, not just about her, but narrated by her. How did that come about?
Well, I was working in the House of Commons at the time as a clerk, and I'd just seen her close up, and I thought that there was so much that people got wrong about her, and also there was something very compelling about the sort of way in which she seemed to know about everything. She was one of her last acts as Prime Minister was dashing around St James's Park picking up litter, and it was as if she knew everything about everything that was going on in the country. And I thought, well, she's an old-fashioned, omniscient narrator of a novel, so I thought I'd write a novel about her. Anyway, it came out, and it was so scandalous that it got me sacked from the job. Which was bliss. In fact, darling Frank Johnson got me to write a cover piece for the Spectator at the time,
wonderful.
30 years ago. And anyway, the novel came out. It sort of surfaced from time to time since. It comes up in Charles Moore's biography as a rare novel of the time that was actually interested in Mrs. Thatcher's appeal. And it's just about to be reissued by an American publisher as a neglected classic, which I can tell you makes me feel.
I don't suppose. Did you ever get any sense that she read it?
No. She wouldn't have read it. She later on, I know she was at lunch with Sebastian Faulks after Alan Hollinghurst's novel, partly about her, had won the Booker Prize, and she hadn't heard of it. And he said, "Oh, you must read this novel, The Line of Beauty." And she was very interested, and she heard all about it. Mm-hmm. And then, as she was going out, she said, "I shall remember that book, The Line of Duty."
No,
which was very much a Margaret Thatcher rewriting of what the novel ought to have been called. I know. I once told Alan this story, and he sort of looked over his glasses at me. I don't know what he thought of that.
Yeah.
But no, she wasn't a great reader.
You wonder what she would have made of the gay sex scenes, it has to be said.
She sort of always averted her eyes from that sort of thing going on in her circle.
Indeed.
She was quite forgiving so long as she didn't have to know about any of that stuff.
Well, Philip, in your excellent books lead for this week's Spectator, you review The Discovery of Britain and Accidental History by Graham Robb, which is all about the popular but sometimes erroneous beliefs about Britain. And I suppose British identity, English identity, patriotism, these are all huge political themes at the moment in politics. So I wonder if perhaps at first you could tell our listeners and our viewers some of the things that you discovered when reading this book.
Well, it's a very British book, maybe even an English book, though he's sort of on the border between England and Scotland, in that it's interested in extraordinary little facts all about a subject, and that I think is a very, very characteristically British thing. You know the TV show Pointless, about knowing facts that nobody else knows. That's been tried in various other countries, and it never succeeds. It's only popular in Britain. And Graham Robb is very much one of those people, just kind of constantly saying, do you know?
Yeah.
And it's hard to think that anyone will get more than 5 pages in this book before finding an amazing fact that they didn't know. I'll give you one example. I sort of vaguely knew that Charles II was very tall. He was actually 6'1", which in the 17th century was absolutely extraordinary. What I didn't know was that he had an extraordinary gift of making himself shorter. So when he was fleeing after the Civil War, there are stories of him meeting peasants who had been told to be on the lookout for a man. And he met somebody who had actually met him about 3 years before, and he said, what sort of man is the king? And the peasant said, oh, he's a little bit like you, but about so much shorter. And it's full of things like that. It's about the way that historical episodes kind of map onto the unique geography of the place. That there are points in England where if you go up onto a high mountain, you can see the sea both to east and to west, and how that might kind of relate to historical episodes, how there are all sorts of things that we've always believed about this country that turn out on investigation to be completely false. It's a fascinating book. And then on top of that, he sort of gives us a sort of strange little autobiography of where his life as a keen observer of odd facts has kind of mapped onto remote historical things. It's an enchanting book.
I'd love to know, as political editor, Tim, which politicians around today do you think are best at kind of playing off historic ideas of England, almost mythological ideas of all Britain, England or Britain? I just wonder, is there any politician at the moment who thinks actually got this down pretty well in terms of using or abusing history and myth about this country to their own gains?
Well, they're always trying to do it, and most of them aren't terribly successful. Very few of them actually have that much historical knowledge. Michael Gove was a rare exception to that, we should say.
The check's in the post.
I mean, whenever you interviewed Boris Johnson, you got this weird melange of sort of ancient Rome analogies with, Cincinnatus or Augustus Caesar or whichever.
The greatest frost since the Great Frost.
Obviously endless attempts to compare himself to Churchill. But it would then be combined with sort of weird stuff from Asterisk and things like that, which is obviously not British, but Belgian. But, that kind of slightly pooterish 1950s public schoolboy kind of literature, which Boris had sort of subsumed into his being. Keir Starmer tried it again at the Labour Party conference. We had this weird melange of things that he wanted to sort of display as being British, the grit of the Lionesses, the swagger of Oasis, and then he talked about slices of orange at half time, and we were at that point drifting well into the realm of David Brent or the Fast Show talking about jumpers for goalposts, and this attempt to sort of define Britishness. John Major famously talked about warm beer and cricket, and it was felt when he did that it was a bit kind of, that was too 1950s to be relevant in the 1990s, a bit twee. I think Starmer just about got away with what he was trying to say, but it's not persuasive. Philip's review is wonderful. In terms of politics, there's this fact in this book about sticklebacks, the fish that he and I both used to catch in our local rivers. Sticklebacks follow the leading fish, and this is perhaps a parody of a parable of British politics. It was discovered that the leader of the sticklebacks is the individual whose brain is damaged or genetically defective. So one is tempted to say that is the kind of fact that those of us seeking for analogies of the British political class might find an excuse to use in anger at some point.
The one thing that you can say about John Major is that he is and was a great reader.
Yes.
And Trollope was his favourite novelist. Keir Starmer is not much of a reader.
He said he doesn't have a favourite novel.
He literally can't name his favourite book.
If he was more of a reader, he would know that Dr. Johnson said that patriotism was the last refuge of the scoundrel.
Indeed.
And that's the point. If you start from patriotism, I'm going to be patriotic,
Yes.
then it feels very false. If you kind of come to a conclusion that you're going to be patriotic because you understand all sorts of things about your own nation, that's a completely different thing.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer was trying to reclaim patriotism from reform, essentially, and, we'll see whether that was successful or not. I think the achievement of Margaret Thatcher was that at a certain point she came to embody it without necessarily actually parading it in the way that Major did or that Starmer is now attempting.
Yeah. Well, Lara, I'd love to get your thoughts. I mean, in Labour Party conference, there's been a lot of accusations that from Labour against reform, that reform are plastic patriots. There's this sort of war about patriotism going on right now. Is this all just a bit futile and silly?
It's really futile and really, really silly. I think what's happening in Labour is they're sort of having an internal war. And they universally think that the country's been sort of hoodwinked by the Daily Mail and GB News and sort of been captivated by this patriotic idea. And now they're fighting over if you pay lip service to it or if you try to fight against it. And the midpoint that Starmer's landed on is trying to completely redefine patriotism into all of the ideals and views that he has, and brand it progressive patriotism, which I think is flags.
Wasn't that a David Lammy phrase originally?
David Lammy phrase originally, but Starmer sort of seemed to run with it in his speech. It's, the British flag, or the St George's flag, plus, potholes and painting fences, which is a small thing, but nobody in Britain paints fences. You stain face, it's a complete American.
Yes, right. It's an Americanism. It's a white picket fence. Yeah.
It's such smart.
Well, so the other phrase that's always used now from all sorts of politicians, actually, left, right, whatever, is British values, which always seems to be kind of, maybe you disagree, but it seems to me to be kind of whatever you want. Whenever you want people to agree with your politics, you just say, "Oh, that's British value," and then you just leave it at that. But I mean, what do you think? Is there more to an idea of British values, or?
I think British values are really, really tricky to define.
Yeah.
I remember when I was younger, sort of Cameron came out with tolerance, and for about 10 years, tolerating mass migration seemed to be the only clear British value we were meant to have. Rob Jenrick came unstuck in the leadership campaign when he got put on the spot and asked what British values were, and really, really struggled for recourse. So you've got sort of the wet, it's fish and chips and community queuing and queuing, which we learned from your article is actually a very, very new
Exactly. Tell us about queuing.
Well, apparently it was it came in with the Second World War, and when Jerome K. Jerome saw it in Edwardian times, he thought it was a Parisian imposition. It's extraordinary. I mean,
I've never seen a queue in Paris.
They've definitely forgotten how to queue if it wasn't Parisian.
Well, we switched places in musical chairs.
The single British value is pointing at people and laughing at them.
Yeah. just cruelty, just basic cruelty. Yeah.
No, it's not cruelty if you're pointing at people in charge.
Yeah.
And just go, look at that perfect chump. What does he think he's doing? Look at him.
There's quite a good argument that we haven't had a revolution since the 17th century because we've taken the mickey out of the people rather than sort of cut their heads off and had revolutions and civil wars and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Since that time.
Yes. I suppose, so that might be the closest we get to a British value, do you think? Just sort of.
Well, the best technique in Prime Minister's questions is not some kind of angry denunciation of the chap across the dispatch box. It's to take the mickey out of them and tell them they're being stupid. And, leaders find that much more difficult to deal with. It's sort of, in other countries, you feel like, the emperor's new clothes would be possible. And in Britain, we would always be laughing at the naked man walking down the street. And, there's a great tradition of that in cartoons and all, I mean, The Spectator is full of great cartoons every week. And, our cover is always, however, we'd say Kemi is fighting back this week. But, she, Starmer and Farage all look faintly ridiculous, and that's exactly how they should look on the front of a leading political magazine.
After the nation's conduct in the in the Second World War has become this kind of flattened out myth. But the thing that people forget about it was that at the height of the war, Noel Coward released a song called "Let's Not Be Beastly to the Germans."
Yes.
I mean, pointing at people and laughing. It's always worked.
Yes.
See why it shouldn't go on working.
Yes.